Hello, I'm Dr. Patrick Carnes, and I'm a senior fellow at the Meadows and the Meadows Institute. And I was asked some time ago to give a talk for PESI on substance abuse, sexuality, and suicide. I call it the Three Canaries in the Cage. So what happened, though, as I was giving the talk was the day that the riots broke out and the internet was overwhelmed, and 1 hour into the talk, 40 minutes of my talk was lost. I felt really bad about it. Not my fault, but it feels very unfinished. So what we have decided to do is to record that talk so everybody, because we had so many requests, so people who said we didn't hear the best parts, and I wanted to make that available to you. So this is, I think, in the language of a do-over, and I am determined to do it because the message in this talk is quite serious. In a few weeks, I will have been in this field for over 50 years. I started on Labor Day weekend in 1970. It's 2020 now. Over that time, I've seen a lot of change in understanding addiction. But where I see us now, there's a very serious problem. And I think we in the mental health community are part of the problem. So I wish to have a talk with you this morning about the realities that are out there. And I want to tell you how I started thinking about it, because it wasn't obvious to me at the start. One of my good friends, who was the former head of the University of Florida's psychiatry department, has a blog. His name is Dr. Mark Gold, and Mark is one of the most published people in addiction medicine. He's got over 1,500 articles. How he does that is amazing to me. But he has this thing called the Addiction Policy Forum, something I highly encourage you to subscribe to. You will see on your screen the open screen for the forum. And one of the things that he came up with is the role of alcohol, drugs, despair in falling U.S. life expectancy. Well, I thought it was a very interesting article because he was talking about the fact that so many people were dying, and was that somehow connected to suicide? He said, now, nobody internally, can you guess, really wants to suicide. We can't make that kind of statement. And Mark is very careful about how he talks about it, but he's raising an issue that's very important. Because suicidality and despair and depression are very connected to this whole problem. I would like to go a little bit further out on the limb. I think if you look at the evidence, you're going to see something that's very alarming. And what I want to do is I want to start with, first of all, where did he get this? The article in front of you now is an article on life expectancy and mortality rates in the United States, 1959 to 2017. What becomes evident, if you look at these, the charts, is that deaths in mortality in the United States as a developed nation has settled steadily up to the year 2000, has taken longer for people to die, and people have lived longer, and that was a steady process. However, if you look at this chart, what you'll notice, here's other wealthy countries: Sweden, United Kingdom, France, And there's a line that says it's kind of the predicted dotted line of where the U.S. should be if the trend line followed the other countries and the trend that we had been at. But you'll see that there is a short circuit at the top. And what happened is we went from a life expectancy of 78 plus years down to 69 years. And most of that is due to addictions. Now, what's important about that is that there's a recent book called Deaths of Despair. And that book by Ann Case and Angus Deaton talk about the fact that there is this division between the wealthy and the poor, of which there's a lot of conversation about in the news right now, because the divide of that is very apparent in the COVID crisis. And how are people going to support themselves? Jobs are changing. All the things that people had counted on have left. And so people are worried about rent, what have you. And the fact of the matter is they make a prediction that despair is increasing dramatically in various parts of our uneducated class, to the extent that if you do not have a college degree, your future in the United States is not very bright. Now, the book has generated a lot of controversy, but I bring it up because it's kind of in the middle of the larger issue I want to talk about is, what happens to depression. And a lot of people look at death because of opiate overdoses and think that's what this is all about. It's not. It is true that 28 to 30% of opiate deaths have contributed to the decline, but it's not the only problem, is what I'm trying to tell you. And the fact of the matter is that it is true that prescription drugs, as particularly opiates and heroin abuse in the United States, are related. There is a transfer of when you can't get prescription drugs, people go to heroin. That's a demonstrated fact. It's also true that our federal government is not adequately, and a lot of issues and controversy about this, that federal data does not really document the fatal overdose deaths caused by specific drugs. So we really need to know a lot more, but we know that there is a problem. And the other thing that's really remarkable is a number of studies looking at people who have been through treatment, and we're talking about 18 months of treatment. Within a matter of a week after they graduate from the treatment program, die of an opioid overdose. And this study caused a lot of concern, because if people are coming fresh out of treatment and then dying, there's something wrong here. And I'd like to make a point that I think is really important for you to think about. People who are addicts really are choosing kind of an oblivion. And as a recovering person, I know that, and as having struggled with this my whole life, depression, the fact is that being in oblivion is better than feeling the pain of the depression. And if you're in oblivion, what's the ultimate oblivion? It would be doing what you're doing until you're dead, which is the ultimate oblivion. So I'm asking you to think about addicts pushing their addictions, doing what they do, being a contributor, that there's an interaction here. I also want to raise another issue that's really important to me, and that is that I believe our culture is there's a model or an example of what happens when a culture is not coping well with its addictions. And a classic example is Germany in the 20s and the 30s. By 1930, most Germans were depressed. And in their depression, what was eating them was the fact that they had these huge reparations to make for a war they didn't feel like they caused, or a war that they felt they lost, because they could have kept on fighting. So they felt sold out. And so Berlin, by the time 1930 rolled around, I mean, depression was rampant everywhere. And people were looking for all kinds of things. No, the Germans were excellent chemists. For example, Bayer, the inventor of aspirin, when he invented aspirin in the very same week, he invented cocaine. And what happened is that 1930 date is very important because lots of drugs were invented, including crystal meth. In front of you is a slide of what is called Pervitin. Pervitin is basically crystal meth and could be bought in any drugstore. A whole packaging effort of making it available to the general population, and even to the extent of making special chocolates and packages for wives to be on Pervitin. Because what did Pervitin do? Crystal meth, first of all, if you're depressed, the depression goes away. Secondly, it gives you a lot of energy. You don't have to sleep. You just get your work done. You feel creative. You feel energized. And the German people needed that at that time. So Pervitin's use was widespread in the 30s. By 1936, most of the Nazi leadership, including Hitler had both cocaine, crystal meth, and vitamins injected in his veins every day by his physician. By 1939, Hitler was really in a psychotic state at times. People don't realize this. Now, what they did, though, in 1939, when they invented and the whole idea of blitzkrieg, in blitzkrieg, you walk over, you take mechanized armor and you walk over your enemy. And in France, you have British and French soldiers, 3-to-1 German soldier. They actually had better equipment than the Germans did. And what happened, however, is the German soldier on crystal meth, and crystal meth was issued to pilots, to soldiers, to submariners, and on crystal meth, you don't have to sleep. You can keep on going. The energy to fight was there in a way that it wasn't for the Allies. There's a whole medical history of this called Blitzed. You can find it on Amazon or anywhere. It tells the story from a doctor's point of view of how all this happened. And Pervitin has one other thing that goes with it. Not only was the Nazi war machine driven by it, and they had to build extra factories to make it, because every, that tube you see in front of you had 12 tabs of Pervitin, which were pretty powerful doses. And the result is that basically when Rommel and Guderian, the generals that were leading the invasion of France, Hitler ordered them to stop. And they said, no, we're having too good a time. And they just went crashing through all the way to the coast of Normandy. And a new style of warfare was invented. It really documented the whole doctrine of blitzkrieg. And the reality, though, it was drug-driven. Guderian and Rommel both were high when they were leading their troops. So the lesson of that is, first of all, it changed warfare. In fact, the British couldn't understand it until a plane, one of the Luftwaffe planes that landed in Germany, they found a survivor's kit, and in it was Pervitin. And when they tested it, they realized this is something they never saw before. And then they were on to the fact and started experimenting with chemicals to stimulate troops themselves, as did the Americans, as did the Japanese. One of the things that happens when you're on crystal meth for any length of time is it affects that part of the brain, what we call the mirror neurons, and basically it's the part of you that has compassion for people. And compassion literally burns out, which is why in a very ethical society that prided itself on its ethics and virtues, by 1939, by 1942, you could have a concentration camp next to you, and I got a picture of that in front of you. You could live next to that, know what's going on there, and not care. The problem here is that when a society becomes totally absorbed in its addictions, compassion leaves people. And compassion scores, as a psychologist, we watch the compassion scores on various instruments that are updated every year. And compassion scores in our general population have gone down steadily for the last 2 decades. Which means we have lost our ability to partner. We have lost our ability to find creative solutions together, to understand the other guy's side. We can't get things through Congress. We can't get things at a state level to get done because we are sharply divided. And is that because we have lost our compassion? I believe it is. I want to point one other thing out. You might say, well, there's lots of reasons people are dying. I'm 76, so many of my friends lately have died of cancer. But one of the truth is the cancer death rate actually has seen its sharpest one-year drop in 2020 that it's ever had. It's not the diseases that we're used to taking people. It's other ones. It's the disease of addictive disorders. Here's an example. A book that I was very struck by, I highly recommend, that you might want to read, is called Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. And I really liked it because Gladwell always has provocative, well-written, well-documented, and he's a good science writer. And what he's talking about is that the sharp increase of sexual assault on college campuses, which has become problematic across the country. He studied those, and what he came to the conclusion and what he was heading for and what the book is about is that compassion issue of not being able to understand the other person's perception, which is why you would have a white police officer shooting a black person that they're arresting. That's his ultimate point, is about the perception. But one of the things that affects the whole process is that kids today are drinking differently than most of us when we were growing up. They are showing up at parties not to drink. They are showing up at parties already drunk. And it's massive, wide, across our campuses. And I'll tell you why that happens in a little bit. But the fact of the matter is, then they continue drinking and they get into the state of what called a blackout, and what scientists talk about, clinicians talk about, myopia. And myopia is literally, you do not remember What happened? You are not aware of the consequences you are doing. That's one of the signs of myopia, is you're doing things that have tremendous consequences. So what happens is people, and he uses numbers of cases, but one specific case as an example, there was a rape by a very highly achieved student. You're absolutely great candidate you'd want in your school. He had high grades. He was an athlete. He was a great performer. And he ended up raping a girl and met at a party. And two graduate students from Scandinavia saw him doing this, took him off the woman, and the police caught him doing this, and she was put into the hospital. She woke up realizing something happened, and they told her she'd been raped. She had no memory of it. This boy who raped her had no memory of it. The way that he talked about it in the screen in front of you is, first of all, he said, drinking heavily 50 years ago pales in comparison to the drinking young adults of college age. Women now equal and at times exceed men in their drinking, and blackouts were once rare are now common. Of college drinkers, over half have had a blackout, 40% in the last year and 10% in the last 2 weeks. Myopia is a major factor in the dramatic increase of sexual assaults on campus. And he writes, the lesson of myopia is really very simple. If you want people to be themselves in a social encounter with a stranger, to represent their own desires honestly and clearly, they cannot be blind drunk. And if they are blind drunk and therefore at the mercy of their environment, the worst possible place to be is in an environment where men and women are grinding on the dance floor and jumping on the tables. A Kappa Alpha fraternity party is not a Kanban drinking circle. What he's saying, and of course the ethics of all this is that to rape someone, you're still responsible, just like an alcoholic who has a DUI in a car accident and causes a death. He's responsible for that. In other words, addiction doesn't excuse the behavior. But you need to understand why this is a problem, why you've heard so many stories about college students and teams and athletes who have been part of sexual assault and the controversy that goes with that. This is really important to understand in terms of the loss of compassion, the loss of the impact of what you're doing. And one of the things that is really adding dramatically to our death rates is the fact that alcohol-related deaths are increasing dramatically. It's not opiates, it's also alcohol. And and I want to point out that the reality is alcohol is a very hard drug. I have been working with a number of our major airlines on pilot drinking. And see, pilots have a problem as they have rules governing layovers that they can't fly again until they've had a time to rest. However, what happens is some of them drink, and I learned something on this that I did not realize. That, and there was a great article done by a team from NASA in 2007, which is really important for you to understand. Blood alcohol, in other words, there's a formula for how much alcohol gets you to the point where you're unsafe to drive, okay? Whether it's wine or mixed drinks or whatever it is you're drinking. And when they put pilots in a simulator, what they found is that the effects of alcohol lasted almost 40 hours. The rules are blood alcohol, and people think that when there's no more alcohol in my blood, that takes 11 hours. And that's what the test is, 12 hours. So they think if they drink and they sleep, they get up, they're okay, no problem. But what they found in the simulator, it's not true, because they're grabbing the wrong instruments, they're flying a plane, and they're landing on top of other planes. They're making all kinds of mistakes. So the impact of alcohol is cumulative and lasts for a while. And people don't realize that. And so you got to kind of look at, in the PowerPoint in front of you, I put this together for the pilots. Because in talking with pilots, what I found is that, first of all, they are a very, very unusual breed of people, tremendously creative. Most of them are very creative, and they have this ability to tunnel their focus, and it's very task-driven. But sometimes, because of their focus, they overlook the obvious. They also have the maladaptive schemas of being very, very perfectionistic, blaming themselves. And successful pilots, especially fighter pilots, have a common attribute of having a history of authority or issues. Little footnote, in World War II, in the Battle of Britain, every ace on both Britain and Germany's side in that battle, the aces had a history of conflict with authorities in the service, which I find really interesting, because they were always put in the tailman Charlie position in air formations because they were a problem to manage. Well, these guys would sit back there and they had a wandering mind, and they would look around and they'd see the enemy before the leader would, and they would just take off and go after them, which is how they got to be aces. The point I'm making is it's a mind that is very difficult in treatment. It's one of the most difficult populations to treat that's documented. So the point is they're rule followers in the sense of they know what they have to pass. I'm just telling the story because I think that alcohol is underestimated in terms of its impact. A book I highly recommend to professionals is, and it's a great title because it is exactly what happens. It's by Judith Grisel. And she writes, as a recovering narcotics addict, she went to school. And in going to school, she decided to become a neuroscientist because she was now in recovery, and she wanted to understand what happens to the brain. And it's a wonderful book, and it details what actually happens to every part of the brain. And her point is that the whole, it's not like you can reach into the brain and just take the addiction out. You can't reach into the brain and take out the self and examine it, fix it, and put it back in. The brain is one organ, it's too complex to do that. And every part of the brain is affected. Now, there's two short stories that are connected to that. It's very important that you understand, and her phrase, never enough, is that no matter what you do, you have this now neural algorithm, if you will, that gets you to the point where it's never going to be enough. And in 1937, there was a physicist who was looking at the issues of how messages travel and what have you. And one of the things that he wanted to show, if he burned off every part, he used his wife curling iron. You can imagine this, taking rats and burning off the parts of the brain that are associated with memory. And when he put the rats back, the addicted rats back in their cage, they knew exactly what to do. So addiction permeates the whole brain, which is why the very famous author Kurzweil, when he looked at all the changes that are happening medically and how if you're living now, you should be adding another 8 to 10 years of your life because of medical technology. He said the one exception of all of that is addiction. That should speak to us because it's very important to understand. We are in the period of COVID and alcohol. And just the end of last week, as I am recording this, the CDC released an ASAM, published it on their policy forum, American Society of Addiction Medicine. The fact is, alcohol and the use of alcohol and suicidality is ramping up. But interestingly, along with that, they are documenting that's happening in obesity, another addiction. In other words, the CDC is starting to see this period is that addiction is increasing on every front. So let's go back and talk a little bit about what goes on in the brain and what does that mean and what actually an addiction is. And then, you know, we can talk a little bit about what we can do about it. The first thing is that the brain, one of the things that there are many different parts of the brain involved, but one of the key ones is dopamine. You see a slide in front of you, which is of the midbrain, and you see a normal brain, and you have red in the center and the midbrain, and then you have an obese person, a cocaine addict, and an alcoholic. And you'll notice the absence of red in each of the addicts. So clearly what that red is about the receptor sites for dopamine. See, the brain doesn't really care where it gets its dopamine from. So the fact of the matter is that food raises your dopamine by about 50%, sex raises it about 100%, cocaine raises it to a couple 100%, nicotine raises it 250%, alcohol raises it about 100%, amphetamines raise it 1,100%. 1,100%, which is why when you talk to a meth addict, they talk about how quickly it happens. It's what we call the supernormal stimulus, which is what we'll talk about when we talk about pornography and in sex addiction, the way that we've seen supernormal stimulus happening. And so what occurs is no one can safely use crystal meth, for example, and not rewire their brains in a couple of weeks. And so the fact of the matter is that it's too powerful to even just use it as a recreational kind of a thing. A great evolution occurred after the year 2000. And what happened is that they started noticing parallels between substance addictions, and they started to notice that compulsive gambling, for example, pathological gambling, that the parts of the brain that were stimulated were the same. They started seeing that in a variety of different directions, especially in the obesity side of things. But there was a big debate that was going on, and the debate was, well, what part of the brain caused it? Well, in Grissell's book, she talks about all the brains being connected, and the reason that rat was able to seek out their addiction is there's a thing called DNA, and DNA, the genetic structure is each gene is hooked onto the internet of the brain and knows what happened. That's why burning off all the memory didn't make a difference. Addiction is embedded in every part of the brain, and it's part of its functioning. So there was a big fight within the addiction medicine community about which theory. There were 7 different theories of what parts of the brain and how it functioned. And then along came a guy by the name of Reddish and his team in 2008. First of all, there was a lecture, Royal Academy lecture in 2005. And the speaker that year in 2005 and sort of talked about the natural addictions. And that sent a wave around the world. And then all the literature that was, we're now able, looking at the brain, looking inside the brain, we could see things. And what happened is all the people from representing the different parts of the brain, Reddish said, you know, they're all right. We're fighting about something that there's lots of ways that the brain operates and participates in addiction. And he talked about that there's various vulnerabilities, 9 different ways the brain was vulnerable. So the point is by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, we had all kinds of evidence that addiction crossed over into many different ways and parts of a person's life. It can be substance-based, it can be food-based, variety and all kinds of excessive behaviors. So what does that mean? What it means is that we have to start looking at addictions differently. This next piece, if you just follow with me the logic of it, you're going to understand something that is a major revolution in mental health. But in order to get it, every discipline that's probably listening today has to listen, including psychiatry, trauma treatment, family treatment, psychology, as well as psychiatry. And the thing is that they all come from different sexology. They all have something to say. Well, so what's happening as our knowledge of genetics is improving, this article is really worth reading because it's a fairly sophisticated statement of it, but they have broken it down by describing basically what happens in the brain. The brain is a platform that energy flows through, electrochemical energy. And as Mate Gabar says, that when addiction starts, almost always, and I put a picture in here of his article, he says, addiction isn't about morals. It usually is somebody's trying to solve a problem. They don't feel okay, and they're looking to solve a problem. So the 13, 14-year-old girl who is not confident of herself, sees that her girlfriends are more confident at parties, they're witty, funny, more attractive. She's having a hard time in school. She's not comfortable with herself. And then she has in her, what she doesn't feel good is that her dopamine genes are not giving her enough dopamine so that she feels at ease. And she takes her first drink. And suddenly, all the misgivings go away. She has confidence, she feels, and if one drink does that, then more drinks do it, which is why you can have somebody who is in an early adolescence using and compulsive drinking. So what we need to understand is that there are people who are predisposed, first of all, to addiction. Then one of the things that can happen, like it's about 23% of the population are predisposed in some ways, but then along comes toxic stress or trauma, and the reality of that is that it causes the genes to change. Enzymes come on that are secreted to try to help with the situation, and they change these little tuning forks we call genes. And the messages to the brain is to give a priority for the feeling better. And they say it happens in stages. It starts with impulsive behavior, and then moves to compulsive behavior, and then it moves to addictive behavior. And this, published by our federal government, documents that process, and it includes obesity, it includes sex addiction, that all these different behaviors are really part of this large process, and that these addictions can switch from one to the other, to the other, to the other, because the brain wants to have the supply of dopamine. It's really useful because in the field of sex addiction, there was a big debate about impulsivity versus compulsivity versus sex addiction. There are, however, biomarkers that go with an addiction. So, in that sense, one of the criteria that is critical is not true of compulsivity. You're having a hard time stopping something. But if you have something that is it's having real consequences and you continue anyway, that means that you have crossed over into a line where the brain has computed a new default position in the brain that we have no way of going in and erasing. Okay, so let's stop. It's a medical condition. Step back for a minute. If you're diabetic and you have a problem, and your doctor says you have to take insulin in order to live, because you have a medical condition, you do that. In mental health, if you have bipolar, we know that the bipolar brain needs to be balanced out in order to keep the cycling or the depression at bay and what have you. But you can be bipolar, just like in insulin, you can have a good life, but you have to accept your medical condition. Really hard a lot of time for bipolars because they start feeling really good and they think they can manage it, and then they go off their meds, and then they go off the rails.